announcements. All right. As we come into this communal space with each other, let us take a moment of silence to recognize all the people here that are with us and take a moment to connect. All right, good morning and welcome everyone to Cache Valley Unitarian Universalists, also known as CVUU. Here at CVUU, we strive to keep open minds in our search for truth and meaning in the spirit of justice, equity, and compassion. We recognize the dignity and inherent worth of each individual. We are a small, lay-led congregation, relying on members and friends as opposed to a professional ministry to provide our worship content and programs. Because of this, our services reflect the diversity of voices that make up this community. It matters not what you believe, everyone with a loving heart is welcome here. My name is Sandra, and this morning I'm serving as your worship associate. So we will start off our service with lighting the chalice. The flaming chalice is a symbol of Unitarian Universalism. The flames of chalices that are lit around the world represent a faith in action. The chalice lighting words are in either the order of service if you downloaded it, or they're up in the chat here on Zoom. So if you would like to join me in the chalice lighting words, please feel free. We light this chalice for the warmth of love, for the light of wisdom, and the energy of action. I have some opening words for you here. The line in life, nature, science, philosophy, religion constantly returns into itself. The opposite poles become one when the circle is completed. All truth revolves about one center. All is a manifestation of one law. All right, so now it's time for our first song. And so I will turn it over to Lindy.
Lindy actually asked me to perform this one.
Oh, okay. Then Jordan.
Yes. So I'm going to share the words on my screen so they're just a little bit easier for you to follow along. If you'd like to join me and Joe in singing, please do. Just remember to stay muted. Let's see. There we go. And a planet, a crystal and a
Thank you, Joe and Jordan. That was beautiful. We each come to worship with our own experiences shaping how we feel. In the supportive community, let us reflect together on the uniqueness of each person through the unison meditation on joys and sorrows that is located either in your order of service or up in the chat here. We gather in this community, sometimes in fear, sometimes in trust, sometimes in joy, but always in hope that we can support and strengthen one another in our common quest for healing and wholeness. I invite you to share the joys or sorrows of the week that are on your mind today, if you would like. You can put your name up in the chat, and as is our tradition, I'm going to light 2 final candles. One for all of those in the world who are still in harm's way, and one for all of those who kept their joys and sorrows in their heart. All right, I have a reading, and this one is a responsive reading if anyone would like to follow along with it. So I read the normal text, and if you would like to join in, like what we normally do is that you would read the text that's in caps lock here. The great end in religious instruction. The great end in religious instruction is not to stamp our minds upon the young, but to stir up their own. Not to make them see with our eyes, but to look inquiringly and steadily with their own. Not to give them a definite amount of knowledge, but to inspire a fervent love of truth. Not to form an outward regularity, but to touch inward springs. Not to bind them by ineradicable prejudices to our particular sect or peculiar notions, but to prepare them for impartial, conscientious judging of whatever subjects may be offered to their decision. Not to burden the memory, but to quicken and strengthen the power of thought. Not to impose religion upon them in the form of arbitrary rules, but to awaken the conscience, the moral discernment. In a word, the great end is to awaken the soul, to excite and cherish spiritual life. All right, and now I will turn the time over to Dave Christian for his talk today on how the human-theist marriage for UUs is working.
Thank you, Sandra. I'll just get my screen shared here. Okay, is that coming through, Jordan?
Looks good.
All right. Let's see. And on my screen, the thumbnails of us all are interfering with my ability to read the right side. Any suggestions, Jordan?
The thumbnails of the video, you can minimize that by clicking the little dash on the top left of that window.
There we go. I am more of a Skype guy than a Zoom guy. I use Skype every day, but oh, thank you. That did a nice job. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I have to, first of all, apologize for pooping out on my last presentation. As you may have noticed, I was scheduled to do I think it was the first Sunday in September, this presentation, and I had a heart attack 3 days before that. And so I was actually in the hospital that day. They put this is my second stent in my heart, but on a positive note, it worked very well and I'm feeling great and back to my usual mischief. Well, as far as this presentation goes, I would like to make it an option for you to make comments as we go. If you've got questions, feel free to interrupt me if you would like. You can also put them in the chat box and we will get to those toward the end. I'll happily answer those or respond to those when we get to the end of the presentation. My goal here is to get you thinking about this topic and have some time for dialogue and interaction at the end. I think we should have that kind of time. Well, the original topic that I was given was humanism. They wanted me to speak a bit about humanism. And this is a reasonable thing to do at a UU church, since the biggest minority of UUs identify as humanists, 45%. However, the rest of UUs are a mix of theists, probably. Theists, and I should add deists. And we'll talk a little bit about that difference. When you think about this, this is rather unusual in a church. Let's take a moment to kind of get clear on what else is going on here. The theists, and we should, again, I'll point out that we have deists mixed in as well. So if we look at theists, they have a belief in supernatural entities, for example, God, deity, spirits, afterlife, and believe that God, or whatever version of God they believe in, plays an active role in life here on the planet. Their epistemology as theists is that tradition, prophecy, divine guidance, inspiration, miracles, holy texts, prayer, ritual, and other methods are ways that we can access the will of God, understand the will of God in our lives, and practice it. Deists are a little bit different, and I know we have deists mixed in with our theists, and I want to make that distinction. A deist believes in a God, or perhaps gods, but that the entity of God is not participating in this world, does not influence us, is leaving us to our own design. So I should make that distinction. We'll be talking mostly about the theists, but we want to acknowledge that we do have deists among us as well. And of course, as you can see from the symbol here, Unitarianism, UU, really tries to be inclusive of all faith traditions, theists and deists. Well, I think the best way to get acquainted with humanism is to take it straight from the humanists. And probably the most succinct statement of humanism that I know is the Humanist Manifesto, which is now in its third version, the Humanist Manifesto 3. And that's what you see on your screen. What I'd like to do, what I've done in this chart is listed the 7 points of the Humanist Manifesto, its third version. And then on the right, I've tried to indicate what I think the typical theist would think of this. Because the thing that I find really interesting here is that we have both theists and humanists mixed together at UU. And it's an interesting marriage, and I'm hoping you'll think about how's this working and why does it work? So what I've indicated in the right column here is what I think a theist would have to say, the typical theist. And again, what is that? There could be liberal theists, conservative theists, but I'm going to use a plus sign to indicate agreement, a 0 to indicate neutrality on the point, and a minus to indicate a negative view. I would imagine a classic theist would take a negative view of the first point here of humanism, which is knowledge of the world is derived by observation, experimentation, and rational analysis. This is the epistemology, the epistemological position of humanism. Epistemology, of course, is the way that we believe we should gain knowledge about the world and our role in it. And of course, the theist is going to find that lacking. Humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change. Many theists will take exception to that. Ethical values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. Certainly a lot of theistic influence missing there, so probably a negative view. Life's fulfillment emerges from individual participation in the service of humane ideals. I think most theists would certainly be neutral or maybe even positive on that one, although they'd see the theistic missing. Humans are social by nature and find meaning in relationships. Theists should get behind that. Working to benefit society maximizes individual happiness. Neutral, maybe positive a bit. And humanists are concerned with the well-being of all, are committed to diversity, and respect those of differing yet humane views. And I think most theists could get behind that one. So that's where we start with humanism versus theism within the UU Church. Maybe a quick way to highlight the difference between theists and humanists could be illustrated by a little story. During the French Revolution, There was a theist and a humanist both charged with crimes against the state, and they were brought to the guillotine. The theist was ushered to the guillotine first, and the executioner said, "Sir, do you have any last words?" And the theist said, "May God save me." The executioner put his head in the guillotine and pulled the tripcord. The blade came crashing down and stopped an inch above his neck. And the crowd roared. They were impressed. This was a miracle. And the executioner had him stand up and he said, "Sir, your God has clearly saved you. This is a miracle. You are free to go." Well, the humanist is ushered to the guillotine next, and the executioner asks him, "Do you have any final words?" And the humanist says, "Just a minute." He bends down, he inspects the guillotine, and he says, "Look, that was no miracle. There's a bolt loose right here on the side. There was no miracle at all. It was due to this bolt getting in the way of the blade's descent." A perfectly rational explanation. The executioner took out his wrench, tightened the bolt, and promptly lopped off the head of the humanist. I'll let you draw what conclusions you may. Well, when it comes to differences of the kind we're talking about here, these kinds of differences have frequently caused schisms in churches. In fact, things much smaller than this have typically caused schisms in churches. So I find it very remarkable that UUs have pulled this off as well as they have. In fact, let's take a quick look at the kinds of things that can cause schisms in churches, and I think you'll see that much smaller issues have caused significant schisms. One of the earliest in recorded history occurred in Buddhism. A cousin of the Buddha, his name was Devadatta. Devadatta had a doctrinal disagreement with the Buddha. He felt that asceticism, living the very, very simple life, was the way to go, and took such great exception with the Buddha that he sent several assassins to kill the Buddha. Being the Buddha simply converted them to his version of Buddhism, and the attack was foiled, and Devadatta and 500 of his followers disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. One of the more well-known schisms that we're probably aware of is that occurred in Islam actually at the time when Muhammad himself died. There was a great schism over which of his relatives should take over the faith and be his successor. And this is where we get the Sunni-Shia schism that has resulted in so much bloodshed and conflict today. And a third schism in Catholicism was over a number of doctrinal and procedural differences, such as selling indulgences. And of course, since the time of Martin Luther, we've seen an unfortunate amount of conflict and divisiveness in the Protestant Catholic division that's occurred as a result of that. So as I was looking at this, the topic that really caught my interest is what is it that CVUU and actually UU, Unitarian Universalism, has done to prevent schisms? Speaking of schisms, I think this next one is just kind of fun. Who knew that schisms played a role in evolution? Well, let's take a moment and talk a little bit about where we're going from here. I'm going to assume that most of you are well aware of theism and its basic tenets. Obviously, it comes in lots of flavors: Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and so forth. So what I'll do is focus on a brief history of humanism, and then we'll take a look at how the UU7 principles fit with humanism versus theism. We'll also take a look at how the UU6 sources fit. I think you're going to notice a very stark difference between how the principles and the sources fit. And then I would like to open it up to discussion. And so as we're going through this, I hope you will think a little bit about how you might respond to these questions. First of all, how well is the theism-humanism marriage in UU working? What do you like about it? In fact, you may find that this actually provides a number of advantages. I'd be interested to hear what you like about it. What are some of the challenges that you have seen personally or are aware of generally that this dynamic tension creates? And what, if anything, can be done to better accommodate the differences? If you have any ideas about that, because I think I've seen this dynamic tension create some challenges that might be addressed better than they have been in the past. So anyway, that's where we're going, and I'll begin by talking about humanism and its history with my own introduction to humanism. This building that you're looking at is the building that I was churched in, if you will. I was raised a good Mormon boy in St. George, Utah. This is the Flood Street LDS Church. It still is there today, looks much the same. And I was instructed, the first time I heard about humanism in this church was in a very negative way. I was trained that humanism was an enemy to faith. This would have been back in the 60s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Humanism was not only an enemy to faith, but it was the evidence of Satan's influence in the world, especially as we're nearing the end times. The rise of humanism was seen as a sign of Satan's influence. And I was also warned away from psychology, which was seen as a humanistic discipline. And I probably should point out that I ended up not only a humanist, but I'm a psychologist today as well. So apparently I'm an oppositional sort of a character. Let's go back in time and do a bit of a timeline on where humanism comes from. Humanism has many, many roots and sources. Many people point out that Buddhism has a strong humanist element in it. In 600 BC, the Buddha asserted that humans do not have a soul or a self. He also was once asked, is there a God and is there an afterlife? He refused to answer the question. His questioner asked him again, is there a God? Is there an afterlife? He said nothing. And the story goes in the Pali text that on the third time, he finally said, there is no way to answer such questions. Therefore, they are not profitable. We should focus our attentions on the things that we can do something about, which namely is to reduce suffering in the present world. That's a fairly humanistic idea. A few hundred years later, Protagoras over in Greece, along with many of the other pre-Socratic philosophers, were coming up with some very humanistic ideas as well. Protagoras said that man is the measure of all things. He pointed out that using reason rather than myth was a better way to explain what was going on in the world. And he also suggested that anthropomorphic or human-like gods really don't make sense. These are all very humanist ideas. A little later in Rome, we have Cicero, a great statesman and politician and philosopher. Cicero also suggested that it was best to rely on reason and kindness to live together in harmony. He felt that to gain wisdom, one of the best ways to do this was to study language, literature, philosophy, history, archaeology, anthropology, law, politics, religion, and art. And notice that these are the topics that are now referred to as our humanities. And they're also considered part of the humanist tradition that to fare best, humans need to understand these human pursuits. And they've been a part of the humanities ever since. In the 1300s, an Italian poet, philosopher, and thinker by the name of Petrarch is credited to have been the father of both humanism and the Renaissance. He was very influenced by Cicero, and he believed, he was a devout Catholic, I might add, he believed that God gave humans vast intellectual and creative potential, and that these should be used to the fullest. He promoted the moral and practical value of studying ancient history and literature, and you might notice, wait a minute, he's a devout Catholic. Is that compatible with being a humanist? You will notice that most of the people who contributed to the development of humanism did have either a religious or a bit of a theistic sort of an orientation. It's very rare that you find a pure humanist or a pure theist, perhaps, and certainly Plutarch is no exception to that rule. Many of us remember Thomas Paine and the role that he played in the American Revolutionary War. He was a British writer and was very supportive of the colonies' movement towards independence. In 1793, Thomas Paine published his book, The Age of Reason, in which he was very critical of, quote, what he called the supernatural pretensions of Scripture. He also criticized the absurdity of a theology built on a collection of Bible folk tales. And he also criticized organized religion, but because he was a deist, not a theist, he did advocate a belief in God. And you'll notice that Thomas Paine, along with many of his contemporaries, many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, I notice we've got George Wooten on with us, and he's quite a scholar of revolutionary times, so I'm sure he could give us many examples of this, but many of our founding fathers identified as deists, and so you'll still see "In God We Trust" on our coins, but remember there's a bit of a distinction between deism and theism. One of my favorite characters in the development of humanism is Charles Francis Potter. Potter is the fellow that you see standing on the right holding the baby. Potter was an interesting fellow. He was a Unitarian minister in this country, and he was asked to advise Clarence Darrow. You may remember Clarence Darrow was the defense attorney for John Scopes. John Scopes was the high school biology teacher who was accused of teaching evolution in Tennessee. And those famous trials, which Darrow defended Scopes, are referred to as the monkey trial. And this Unitarian minister was the biblical advisor to Clarence Darrow. But Potter was a very interesting fellow. He founded the first humanist society in New York City. And I find this quote from Potter very classic for the way that humanists see religion, and he's got some interesting ideas about the interaction of the two. He says, "Humanism is not the abolition of religion, but the beginning of real religion. By freeing religion of supernaturalism, it will release tremendous reserves of hitherto thwarted power. Man has waited too long for God to do what man ought to do himself and is fully capable of doing." So Potter, you can see here that there was clearly a connection between the Unitarians and humanism fairly early on. In 1933, not long after, at the University of Chicago, a large conference was called together, and I might add, the 30 people who came together were, the biggest subgroup of them were Unitarian and Universalist ministers. And these 30 individuals came together and came up with the first Humanist Manifesto, which frankly bears a close resemblance to the one that I gave you at the beginning, the third version. Today, this has grown into the American Humanist Association. This is their logo that you see on the left, and their motto is "Good Without God." Okay, we've done a whirlwind tour of humanism, what it believes, where it came from, some of its sources. And now let's ask some questions. How do humanism and theism fit within Unitarian Universalism? It would seem they make strange bedfellows, or this is a strange marriage. I think one of the best ways to do this is to begin by comparing them with regard to the UU 7 principles and the 6 sources. So here we have UU 7 principles, and I won't read these in detail because I think you're all familiar with them. But again, I've used this very simple coding system. On the left, I've put what I think the average humanist would think about this principle, if there is such a thing as an average humanist. And on the right, I've used the same coding system to put what I think a typical theist. And I should say liberal theist, because frankly, I don't see many conservative theists showing up at UU churches over the years that I've participated. If you are a conservative Catholic, you're probably going to be in the Catholic Church. If you're a conservative Baptist, you're probably going to be in the Baptist Church. If you're a liberal Catholic or a liberal, very liberal Baptist, you might show up at the UU Church. So again, when we speak of theism here, it's the liberal end of that spectrum. And I might add that when it comes to the humanist response, I'm thinking from the perspective of a conservative humanist, a very, or rather I should say, well, depends on what you want to call conservative or liberal, but a mainstream humanist would probably be just attending the meetings of the American Humanist Association, which, by the way, we do have here in Utah. So anyway, with that caveat aside, I think you can quickly see that about the humanists would be happy with all of the 7 principles. At most, they would be mediocre on the 3rd principle, which is acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth. I mean, spiritual, they might take a bit of a exception to the term and wonder how you define that. Everything else, I think, checks out nicely from the humanist perspective. On the theist side, I don't see any problems. It seems like all 7 principles would make good sense to most liberal theists. But here's where things get a little weird when we go back to the next level, which is you use 6 sources. That's where I think a lot of differences occur. And this makes sense because the fundamental way to me that a humanist and a theist differ is their epistemology, how they go about what do they believe is the correct source of information for knowledge about the world and our place in it. And of course, we see differences here. What I've done here is taken the 6 sources and highlighted the terminology that I think would give trouble to a classic humanist. So on the first one here, experience of the transcending mystery, references to spirit are going to be problematic, but happy for the theists, they're fine with that. The second one, words and deeds of prophetic people, prophecy doesn't play much, doesn't carry well for most humanists. It does for theists. Wisdom from world religions, inspiring a spiritual and ethical life. Going to have some problems with that. Jewish and Christian teachings and God's love. These references might be a problem for the average humanist, not for the theist. And when it comes to the 5th source, humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason, science, avoiding idolatries of mind and spirit, that's probably the only one of the 6 sources that really would resonate solidly with a mainstream humanist. And then finally, we've got references to spiritual teachings, sacred circle of life, rhythms of nature that may not set well with the humanists in Principle 6 and would be at least neutral, maybe positive for the theists. So when it comes to the sources, it seems that's where we might find the biggest place for a bit of heartburn, especially for our humanist friends within our congregations. Well, as I was hoping would happen, we've got time for some discussion. We've got several questions here, and these are the ones that you saw earlier. Again, a quick review. How well is the theism-humanism marriage working from your perspective? What do you like about this marriage? For those of you who've been around it long enough to have some opinions, I'm interested to hear what those are. What challenges does it create? What can we do to accommodate the differences that are here? And frankly, any other thoughts you have would be very interesting. So I'm going to get back where I can see or interact with the rest of you. What are your thoughts about this? Let's open it up to some discussion here.
And you'll need to stop sharing, Dave.
Very good.
Yes.
There we go.
I'll go ahead and leave the recording on during the discussion, but if anybody's not comfortable being recorded and put on the website, you can just let me know, and I'll just cut that. I'll just cut that bit out of the recording.
Any thoughts here? And again, maybe I'll start off with one of my own. I really do, as I was putting this together, thinking this is actually quite remarkable to me that Unitarian Universalism has pulled off a marriage of this sort. You look at the diversity that you find. Well, let's go back just to the original merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists. That occurred in 1961. That you can merge 2 different churches and that's the opposite of a schism. That's bringing 2 different churches together. That's a remarkable feat. But now, if you look at the evolution of Unitarian Universalism, we now have even more diversity. There's been a real effort to include people of non-Christian backgrounds. We've certainly made efforts to make humanists feel comfortable here, and they've become the dominant minority in the group. it's really quite remarkable to me what Unitarian Universalism has pulled off. How did they do this? I think in a world like we have today, where we see so much divisiveness, this is a refreshing alternative to what typically has happened.
Dave, I have a question on that. From what you know of the Unitarian and Universalist merger, is there more humanists from the Unitarian side of things than the Universalist side of things? Or are there humanists kind of coming from both of those lineages? Or do you know?
Oh my goodness, that's a very good question you've asked, Jennifer. And I don't know my Unitarians, my pure Unitarians and my pure Universalists to have an opinion. Of course, both of those were originally Christian denominations. They had different opinions, but so I suspect they were very liberal already and had a strong humanist flavor to them. But I don't know if one had more humanist flavor than the other.
I think we might have a secret third U.
Yeah?
Yes, utilitarianism.
Ooh.
Because we see what works for us and what works for other people. And from either a human or a theist side, you could see how that might be different for different people.
So let's not change our name. That would be really a
That's enough
mouthful.
U's for Jordan.
No, I kind of like this idea, Joe. I think we ought to think about being U cubed. We can't do U2. That's a rock group. That's my wife's favorite rock group. So we can't encroach on U2, but U cubed is still open, I think.
You know, I think that it really matters the group that you're in. And like back in the East, in the US, some of those very old, they're now UU churches. They came from a Unitarian tradition. They're much stronger Christianity in their background. But they certainly have embraced the new, you know, the seven principles. And so, but it feels more like a Protestant church almost, you know, in some of those congregations. So it matters, the history of the group itself and the congregations, I think, matters a lot, how well the marriage is going.
Sometimes difficulty and challenge that we have in our wording, the wording that we use in our services and everything, and the regional differences are a big part of it. Because when Unitarian Universalism decided to spread out and create the fellowships, so out west here we tend to have a different, just a different way of doing things. You know, the fellowship versus the more traditional church, and so I found that, you know, some people would like to use more wording, God and that sort of thing, and find that to be more spiritual, and sometimes find that they're missing a bit of spirituality in these congregations where a lot of people have an aversion to those more traditional words, you know, God and let me think, sermon or homily. You know, some people have aversions to those more like traditional Christian and churchy words, and so that's one of the issues that we kind of run into, and that a lot of UU churches run into, and you know, somehow we kind of come together and find something that seems to work for everyone.
I'm glad you brought that up, Sandra. Is there something we can do to make that wedding work better? Because I have been in congregations when the wording got too theistic, and I've seen people walk out of the service, literally walk out of the service, and I'm pretty sure I know why. They're probably very strong atheists from what I know. And I think I've seen the opposite happen when it leans too far the other direction. Is there something that we could do in general to improve that, make it more comfortable and workable for both camps? Not just you, you may have ideas, but I'd open it up to anybody who has thoughts on that.
It's a tough one. That's something that we discussed in the UUA training, and I mean, usually most of the time what happens is people try and kind of meet somewhere in the middle. And sometimes if we have a feeling that, there's going to be too much God in here for a good percentage of the congregation, or the other way around, sometimes we kind of give a little, people will give a little bit of a warning for that service.
I call it, sorry to interrupt, but I call that context. And I find people are really open to hearing about the Christian side if you put it in context of why, and not just surprise them when you start saying, this is what God says,
Yes, exactly.
Any other thoughts on that while we're on that? Because I know within the group we've got here, we have folks who have attended lots of different UU churches around the country and had many more years of experience. I see one of them on screen now. Jay, do you have a thought about this, Jay?
Yeah, I did. I still do have that thought. We belonged to or attended a number of them. And I keep finding both, I think, a goodness and a problem with the personality that the humanists tend to gravitate toward. The ones that have worked best have been the churches in which there's a charismatic leader or group of leaders and a sense of a buy-in to a community that is not necessarily a universal community, but it's idiosyncratic to that particular group. And I've seen a couple of churches almost fall apart because the designated leader was riding a pony that a number of the other folks just disagreed with, and it's almost one of the curses of humanism is the personality-driven nature of it, which probably shouldn't be.
I agree with that 100%. We've been to a lot of UU churches and have seen when there is a dynamic and sensitive leader, knowing how to say the things from up front that embrace all points of view, preparing people for an idea to think about. But I really feel that that's the churches we've enjoyed have given us space to choose where we want to lend our thinking to. And I like it when somebody gives me an idea that is different than what I think, because then if they build on presenting that idea, then I think about it a little deeper. And so I begin to integrate whether that's comfortable or not and why. And so I like a church that provides me the opportunity to still learn in maybe not in just spiritual ways, but in meaningful ways. Does that make sense? To make meaning in life. That's what drew me to, and us, I think, to the Unitarian Universalist Church. There's a lot of space for choice and a lot of freedom to pursue a path to believing something in a meaningful way to make meaning in your life. And a lot of that depends on strong leadership.
No, I appreciate that, Leslie, and I think I've seen the same. The congregations that and the sermons, if we'll call them that I've enjoyed most, have done a very good job of being integrationists. They they are open to and respectful to both theistic and deistic and humanistic views, and that is a real art to pull that off. They can they're switch hitters. They can go both ways, but not in a way that offends the other camp, and they can show respect to both sides without seeming to play favorites. And that's, boy, certainly something we see sorely lacking in our politics and other aspects of our public life these days. But I think Unitarians, Universalists have probably pulled it off better than I've seen in any other sphere of public life. And I see from just in the comments column here, want to acknowledge we've Lindy says humanist flavor, loves it. I can share on that a little too. Oh yeah, I think Lindy did share, but share again if you have more, Lindy. And Robert Schmidt says Unitarian Universalism, space to choose. I resonate with that. It's a great place to have space. At least that's the intention, is to create that space, it seems.
I just thought that I should tell the joke that everyone told me when I first took the job as a music director, is that why are Unitarians bad singers? Because they're always reading ahead to see if they agree with the lyrics. And I think that that is actually a good portion of my experience here, is that people don't, maybe in other congregations, people walk out of sermons that talk too much about God, or conversely don't talk enough about God. But here I think people just kind of stop participating for a second, and then when the part that makes them uncomfortable is over, they jump back in. And so I think that, at least that's my experience, and I think it's working okay. I think it's going all right.
I love that.
Maybe we just won't ever be great singers, and that's okay.
Well, thank you, Lydia. I think that's a lovely note to leave off on. It captures so much. I will turn the time back to, I guess, Jordan, are you the one conducting for us?
That'll be Sandra.
Or back to Sandra, sorry.
And I'm going to be turning it back to Lindy for our next song.
Here we go. So I switched out the song. It's not the one in the order of service. I love this marriage metaphor, and it made me think of this song by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds called Into My Arms. And I thought that I would just do that song real fast. I don't know if anyone knows it, but I think you'll see why in just a second here. So here's the lyrics, hopefully. There we go. Well, I don't believe in an interventionist God. I know, darling, that you do. But if I did, I would kneel down and ask him not to intervene when it came to you, not to touch a hair on your head, leave you as you are. If you felt he had to direct you, then direct you into my arms, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms. I don't believe in the existence of angels. But looking at you, I wonder if that's true. But if I did, I would summon them together
ask them to watch over you. To each burn a candle for you, to make bright and clear your path, and to walk like Christ in grace and love, and guide you into my arms, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms. But I believe in love, and I know that you do too. And I believe in some kind of path that we can walk down, me and you. So keep your candles burning, make them bright and pure, but you'll keep returning always and evermore into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms, oh Lord, into my arms.
Thank you, Lindy. That was perfect. All right. So now we have the offering. Part of being a faith in action is sharing our financial resources with those in our community. And I have a little quote from the book here. The offering is a sacrament of the free church. It is supported by the voluntary generosity of all who join with us. The offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation of our shared hopes and values. And so I think Jordan just put the link up there. If anyone would like to give to the offering today. And I have some closing words before we extinguish our chalice, and then we can have some time for more conversation afterwards. All right, closing words. For all who see God, may God go with you. For all who embrace life, may life return your affection. For all who seek a right path, may a way be found, and the courage to take it, step by step. All right, so now we'll extinguish the chalice. And if you would like to join in with the unison words that are in the order of service or up in the chat, you can kind of see my computer all the way over there. Right. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of courage and commitment. These we carry in our hearts and out into the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.